Russian President Vladimir Putin says that the involvement of powers from outside the Middle East in the conflict with Iran was moving the world towards great danger. Earlier, Putin hosted Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqchiin in Moscow and told him that there was no justification for the U.S. bombing of his country. For more on this, let's now speak to SABC News correspondent Dasha Chernyshova, who's live for us in Moscow. Dasha, a very good afternoon to you. So there's still questions in terms of how Iran will retaliate following the USA's strike on those 3 nuclear sites in Iran, especially given the fears around the possibility now that Iran could close the Strait of Hormuz. Firstly, speak to us and give us a sense of what was discussed between President Putin as well as Iran's foreign minister.
Well, that was indeed a very important meeting that we understand has been scheduled actually well in advance. The Russian president, in his welcoming remarks to Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqchiin, said that Moscow believes the American actions against Iran were an unprovoked aggression that cannot be justified. Moscow also says that it is ready to provide assistance to Iran, saying that Moscow has already suggested that it could mediate these conflicts resolution through diplomatic means, but also saying that Moscow has internationally voiced its strong position and strong condemnation of the American attacks against the nuclear facilities of Iran, as well as the Israeli actions in the region as well. So Moscow says that indeed what the two have been trying to do in Moscow is to find the way out of this escalated tension through the diplomatic means. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has issued a short statement following the negotiations that the focus was indeed on steering this regional tension into the peaceful solution, but also taking the note that there are very divergent views of the parties involved into this conflict. Also, Abbas Araqchiin said that he welcomed Russia's support and has stressed that indeed Iran does need help. The Kremlin earlier suggesting that Moscow will assist, but those assistances will be dependent on what Iran actually needs. And with regard to that, he did not reply whether Russia would be willing to provide its S-300s or S-400 air defense systems to the Iranian side. So at this stage, it does seem that Moscow wants the de-escalation of tension and the return to the negotiations.
Interesting that you mention that they did not answer that question, the kind of assistance that Russia is willing to provide, because as the U.S. becomes more involved, there are questions in terms of just how China and, in fact, Russia will position itself. Last week, you'll recall, of course, we were reporting on how both President Putin and China's president held that telephone call about this particular matter. When we look at both of these countries, just give us a sense in terms of what their position is.
Well, the position of Russia as well as the position of China, we understand, are very coherent here. It is a gross violation of the international law and the UN Charter. Moscow is saying, actually, at the UN Security Council meeting, that the American strikes against the sovereign territory of Iran have opened the Pandora's box with unclear consequences for the global non-proliferation regime. So in Moscow, there is a very strong sense that the U.S. is doing what it sees fit. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind that Moscow and Washington have been trying to mend their bilateral ties, and there's been no resolutions coming from the Americans that would be criticizing Russia over the course of the past weeks, ever since Donald Trump, the new American president, took to the Oval Office. And many analysts here in Moscow have been suggesting that indeed Russia's vocal support for Iran could be something that can jeopardize the restoration of ties between Moscow and Washington, because Donald Trump is that kind of person who can get offended very easily. Again, this is the assessment of some political analysts, but that could certainly be something that the Kremlin will be watching for, although the official statement suggests that relations between Moscow and Washington and the international agenda when it comes to those strikes are completely different tracks. But obviously, Russia has been very critical of those American actions, and so was China. So at this stage, it does seem that this condemnation will only continue, especially if the United States will decide to get involved even more.
Dasha, thank you so much for that update. Really do appreciate it. That's SABC News correspondent Dasha Chernyshova.